what they're giving, cause I'm working for a living. Hey, I'm not complaining cause I really need to work, but hitting up my buddies got me feeling like a jerk. $100 car note, 200 rent. I get a check on Friday, but it's already spent. Working for a living, working for a living, working for a living, living and a working. I'm taking what they're giving, cause I'm working for a living. Whoa, working for a living. Whoa, taking what they're giving. Whoa, working for a living. Busboy, bartender, ladies of the night, grease monkey, ex-junkie, winner of the fight. Walking on the streets, it's really all the same. Selling souls, rock and roll, any other game. Working for a living, working for a living, working for a living, living and a working. I'm taking what they're giving, cause I'm working for a living. Working for a living, living and a working. I'm taking what they're giving, cause I'm working for a living. Working for a living, living and a working.
Welcome to Western Insights. Today's show is brought to you by Western's College of Business and Economics in partnership with the Western Alumni Association and Foundation. Our intention with Western Insights is to extend our expertise far beyond the classroom with our own internal subject matter experts and external guests. Trying to keep up with how the different parts of the economy are doing during our recovery has been challenging for most people. It seems that within minutes, you can find one article that shows you how things are moving in the right direction and another that leaves you with a sense of dread. The thing is, they're probably both right. It gets complicated fast with economic indicators, and that unfortunately is not new. In the past few weeks, you've probably seen stories about how there are some 8 million fewer people working since the beginning of the pandemic. And yet, for some reason, we're also reading about how employers cannot find applicants for their open positions. Some have reported there are 3 open positions for every applicant. And this is just the beginning of where most people start scratching their heads and forming thoughts about what is going on. But what is really going on? That's where we're going to start today as we explore the complex world of workforce dynamics, the labor market, and how people are deciding what is in their own best interest. To help us along the way today, we have Jonathan Cox, who is a data analyst with Chmura Economics and Analytics. Before joining Chmura, he worked as a public policy and economics fellow for the Cuyahoga County Department of Development in Cleveland. He holds a bachelor's degree in business economics and public policy from Brown University and a master's degree in economics from the University of Wisconsin. John Jenks Beyer is the director of recruiting for BECU, the Boeing Employees Credit Union, the nation's largest community credit union. John and his team execute hires for all of BECU's 50+ locations annually. Prior to BECU, John led recruitment for Real Networks, a global media software company, as well as holding recruitment and talent program management roles with Swedish and JP Morgan Chase. He also acted as a workforce development manager in higher education, built a regional sourcing program for one of the nation's largest contingent staffing companies, and served as the deputy political director for a U.S. senator. John is also co-chair of the Career Advisory Board here at Western Washington University, which we deeply appreciate his commitment to and gifts to the university, and he also volunteers with other nonprofit organizations. Dr. Hart Hodges rounds out our panel today with bringing 3 hats. He's a professor at economics at Western, also the co-director of our Center for Economic and Business Research, and he also serves as a board member for the Northwest Washington Workforce Development Board. Hart received his PhD in economics in 1994 from the University of Washington, joining the faculty at Western in the fall of 2000. His research interests include natural resource and environmental economics, health economics, and applied business economics. Hart is currently managing several research projects and public service efforts with an emphasis on economic development. There's a lot of great people on this panel today. Moderating all of this in our discussion today is Dennis Deschile, who is head of organizational and talent development here at Western, in addition to private consulting, executive coaching, training, and keynote speaking. Having spent 2 decades as a mental health and employee assistance professional, Dennis has experienced the intimate inside workings of hundreds of organizations in the Pacific Northwest. So a little housekeeping before we dive in. Closed captioning is available for this event. Using Zoom, you may activate this feature at any time through the closed captioning button in your menu bar. Some of you have submitted questions with your registration, and we always appreciate seeing those ahead of time. If you do have additional questions today, which we're pretty sure you're going to, please just jump in with using the Zoom Q&A feature, and that's also in your Zoom menu bar. We will be responding to questions throughout the discussion today, so don't be shy. Finally, since our topic today will involve many statistics and observations, it's important to note that we're recording the session on the morning of June 11th, 2021. For those who may be viewing this later, your results may vary in the future. With that, Dennis, let's dive in.
Great, thanks, James. Hey, everyone. We're going to have a great conversation today. I am really pleased to be here with this panel. The conversations leading up to getting ready for this webinar have been fascinating to me, so I'm sure the audience is going to get a lot out of this. We certainly hear a lot of folks talking about the state of employment and employee availability these days. It seems like we might be turning some corner to normalcy as vaccination rates continue to rise, but we might also now see that their return to normalcy might not be a return to the pre-COVID status quo. Maybe a new normal is coming at us. So I'm excited to see what insights our panel of experts have to offer today. We're going to get out of the gate with a question for each of the panelists, starting with you, Hart. So Hart, what's going on with these statistics of 8 or 9 million open jobs and employers not being able to find qualified applicants?
Well, thanks, Dennis. Not an easy question. I hope no one's looking for a simple answer or a single cause. The sharp increase in job openings is really not that surprising, given how quickly we're reopening everything, with people starting to travel, going out to eat, so much more. But we've never seen so many jobs appear in such a short time span. So here we are with nearly 9 million job openings. To be sure, people are going back to work, and the number of people filing for unemployment has been dropping, but the process is rather complicated. One factor is confidence. A lot of job openings that have been announced lately are in the leisure and hospitality sector, which requires face-to-face interactions, and some people are going to take time before saying, "Yep, I'm ready for that." Another factor that I think a big one is choice. If you don't have to go back to your old low-wage food service job, maybe you'll explore other options, and that job sorting, matching a person with job, if you will, is a good thing, but it takes time. It's not a matter of quickly moving, millions of people from unemployment to work. Before taking a job, people are asking about safety, whether that job's going to be around long with automation or whatever. And they're asking those questions because they can, right? Lots of jobs available. So I think there's a sort of a paradox in that the more jobs are available means workers can take more time, and that has layers to it. I might be thinking, I still want to be in food service, but I'm waiting for this other restaurant to open back up. I'm not in a rush. Or maybe I've decided I want to do something new. I've spent a year getting to know myself a little differently, trying different things. Job type. Some of the other panelists are going to, I'm sure, mention skills gaps and aligning new jobs with folks. Mobility. The jobs that are open may not be where the people live. And that gets complicated. Maybe I can't move because of childcare, caring for an aging parent. Maybe I'm unemployed, but my spouse isn't, right? It gets sort of rich there. I'm sure we'll talk some about the unemployment benefits and whether that matters. I also know I'm missing a few things. So I'm hoping you ask a similar question to the other panelists. We've got some good folks here. For now, I'll just say we have a huge number of jobs available. That's not all that surprising. We have lots of people not working, which also isn't surprising given what happened. And we have, once again, COVID accelerating things into timeframes that we're not used to. And that compression or acceleration is quite challenging. So Um, I'll stop there and see where else you take us with this stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Hart. And I appreciate you getting us out of the gate with making sure the audience understands there's the complexity to trying to answer this question of what's going on. And I know sometimes people try to throw out single answers, and there's a lot going on. There's not a single answer to describe things. There are a number of themes. Thanks for that, Hart. Well, John, coming to you next, with your role at BECU and from your professional connections, what do you see in regards to applicants and hiring? Why are employers not finding what they're looking for?
I think I want to echo what Hart said, and something we were talking about just before going live with the panel today is we have never had a economic recession that is driven by a global pandemic. And generally speaking, when it's a market-driven recession, the return to normalcy in terms of employment opportunities is much longer, with vaccination rates across the country really getting to a point where people feel comfortable doing exactly like Hart said, traveling. I'm actually going to be on my first plane flight tomorrow morning since February 2020, going out to eat, going to resorts, hotels. We're seeing just an unprecedented number of jobs be posted at once within the span of weeks. And there's evidence that really underpins that. 42% of small businesses surveyed last month say they have job openings going unfilled, which is a record number. So this is really crossing a lot of different industries right now. And I think there's a number of potentially contributing factors. Some employees displaced during the pandemic have moved into other career fields that had more demand and or may have offered more safety, leaving behind prior careers in hospitality, restaurant, retail sales, etc. Employees may not feel safe yet returning to a workplace that puts them in close proximity to customers, clients, and or fellow employees. Parents may not have childcare or daycare available right now that allows them to return to work, and or like Hart mentioned, they may be caretaking for a relative, somebody who may have been impacted by COVID, for instance. I know at least a couple of folks who are in that space right now, especially in hospitality roles where compensation is based partially on tips. Candidates may be electing, or workers may be electing, to remain on unemployment versus returning to a workplace where they can only seat 25 to 50% of their capacity, which equals much lower potential take-home pay for them. And new entrants to the regional employment market are hiring for remote-based positions, offering other alternatives and potentially drawing talent away from companies that may be requiring employees to return to an in-person work environment. We are definitely seeing this at BECU, especially for hiring in positions for our neighborhood financial centers and our member contact centers. Our applicant volumes have gone down over what they were, let's say, pre-pandemic, even when we look at February 2020 as being a historic low. I think that was a historically low unemployment number in the greater Seattle area. And so our team has been responding by enhancing our sourcing and recruitment marketing efforts, really bolstering our employee referral program, and partnering with our client leaders on additional recruitment and retention strategies.
That's great. Thanks, John. By the way, how many people work for BECU?
As of last month, it's about 2,600. So in the past 5 years, we have grown the employee workforce by 100%.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of exposure to what's going on with trying to hire. I appreciate that.
Team's been busy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hey, and now coming to Jonathan. Jonathan, you have a tremendous data set at your disposal working with Chmura, and a unique perspective from a lot of us in terms of looking at data points and analyzing all kinds of different things that the average person isn't able to look at. So I'm interested to understand, what are you seeing in the data that helps explain this apparent disconnect between job postings and job seekers? What are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for the question. So I think I'll start with some cheerful news. Sort of looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics Laos data set, we've already captured about 96% of the employment we lost since March 2019, sort of when the pandemic really started to affect employment here in the United States. So looks like we're sort of getting back to those sort of pre-COVID staffing levels. So that's some good news there. However, sort of one potential area of concern is that there's still about 3.1 million fewer workers in the labor force nationwide. And to be considered part of the labor force, you need to be employed or need to actively have been seeking work at some point in the last 4 weeks. Also, you can still be considered unemployed and part of the labor force if you've been laid off and you're expecting to be recalled to work. So you don't necessarily need to actively be seeking work if that's your case there. So those folks are still part of the labor force. And John Hart sort of mentioned some theories about this, but the $1 million question in my estimation is sort of, who are these people who've left the labor force and sort of what has prevented them from sort of seeking out work. Also, in terms of unemployment, it is still about 30% higher nationwide than the pre-COVID March levels. So that is also still a potential area of concern, but at least those people are still actively seeking work. So that sort of gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what we're seeing in the data from sort of the labor supply side, the worker side, the job seeker side. In terms of what we're seeing in the labor demand side in the data, here at Chmura, we have a job posting database we create by crawling the internet daily for online job posts from over 40,000 different sources. And looking at the job posting data we have available, there does appear to be a surge in the volume of job postings across almost all the occupation groups when you compare April to June of 2019 to this year. So sort of in line with what John was saying and on heart of sort of that increase of the number of job posts that are going out there. So it looks like employers are sort of continuing to staff up to their pre-COVID employment levels. Although the largest increase in job posting volume for that time period I mentioned was for heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers, about like 143,000 more job postings in our database for that specific occupation. Registered nurses had a large increase, and stockers and orders fillers also had a large increase in the volume of job posts. So like the largest increase still sort of tend to be in the healthcare sector and the transportation / warehousing sector, which it makes sense with sort of what the pandemic has sort of changed the working world a little bit. Also in the data, we do see some possibility of skill mismatch. For example, for computer occupations, we see an increase in the number of ads that ask for applicants to have experience with like cybersecurity matters, which makes sense to sort of how a lot of the business and work that has been conducted online over the past year. So that's a topic on present mind. We've also seen a trend for sales and marketing occupations, for example, like marketing managers, for them to have experience using sort of cloud computing technology, increasing those ads. So there's a possibility, there might be some skill mismatch between applicants there. That's sort of yet to sort of draw a conclusion either way. And then sort of finally, I'll just mention that yes, there's also been an increase in the job postings for food and beverage occupations. So those fast food and counter work, those fast food workers. Although the increase is not in sort of the top 25 largest increases in job ads for occupations, there still is an increase, but it's also possible that our data set might be underestimating the demand for this occupation just because, a lot of times some of these positions are not always posted online. You go to your local Wendy's or something like that and see open interviews 24/7. So just to say, it looks like businesses around the country are staffing back to the pre-pandemic levels, and there still looks like there's a sizable number of people who are not in the labor force and just not looking for work.
Appreciate that. And you know, I know we all pay attention to, there's a complexity to the statistics we hear. I appreciate you talking about, if somebody hasn't been looking for work in the last 4 weeks, they might not be included in the numbers, but that doesn't mean they're not going to eventually be looking for work. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And perhaps the shift that might have come about in terms of more positions in trucking and in healthcare, some things that might have changed in our environments, and the skill gap conversation. That's an interesting thing too, in terms of, again, what's shifted in terms of demand, but also what's going on with, is there a mismatch, and are there things we can pay attention to around that? I know we're going to talk more about the skill gap as we go forward. Thank you, Jonathan. That's great to hear. We're going to get into some audience questions that folks have shared with us leading up to the webinar. Some people shared some questions ahead of time. If you're in the audience and you do have a question, feel free to put it on out, and we'll be culling through those and trying to see which ones we can bring forward here. So I really encourage you to bring that forward. We want to make sure that if you're not hearing something you really want to hear this panel talk about, that you let us know, because there's a lot of good information in these folks. So going forward, you know, one of the other things I wanted to note that I forgot to mention earlier is we were paying attention as we were getting ready going into this webinar to the cross section of the humans that we have here. And I know as we talk about things, we're going to want to acknowledge some of the different ways that the changes in employment and the pandemic have impacted by gender. And we were recognizing, of course, that we do not have a female panelist with us today. And that makes a difference, and doesn't mean that it's not being thought about very intensively. And we wanted to recognize that. So I just wanted to come back and note that, because I didn't say it earlier. So let me get into the first audience question that we already had available to us. Hart, this is coming to you. We have someone wondering how much of what we're seeing, and this is, I think, the big question everybody's asking these days, how much of what we're seeing is being explained by unemployment benefits? Is the extra $300 a week that's still happening in many states, is that enough to make someone not look for work? What are you seeing in that regard?
Well, the academic studies I've seen suggest the answer is no, that the extra benefits don't make that big of a difference. But I think what those studies are showing is that the extra benefits by themselves are not enough to keep people from going back to work. But I think the extra benefits matter. Some of the stuff I touched on a moment ago, for example, the benefits could allow me to be a bit more patient in my job search, which ultimately I think is a good thing. I mean, people know that the benefits have been nice, but they're not long-term. They're not an alternative to work or a career. You still need to get a job, and hopefully one that lets you build something over time and increase your pay over time. So no one is saying that they're not going back to work because of the benefits. But if I'm nervous about a safety issue, or if I'm exploring a new field, I'm trading from my old food service job to something else, it gives me a chance to do that. So I think the extra benefits have had an impact, but they're not the reason for the disconnect in the labor market. We had Employment Security announced recently that people will have to be searching for work to receive benefits, something that Jonathan was hinting at. And then other states are saying they're going to end the extra benefits altogether. So we'll see in the coming weeks and months how labor force participation rates change when the benefits go away. As a data guy, it'll give us new information, and that'll be fun. We'll see how much that changes our answer, but I'll stop there.
I appreciate that. And so the benefits, they matter. They're part of the bigger formula, but they're not a primary driver for what we're seeing compared to a lot of other factors. And I think that's a big answer right there for people to consider, because this is something we see being thrown around by pundits and whatnot. And so if we can come back to the data and know where that's coming from, that's great information to have. Thanks, Hart. Hey, our second audience question comes to you, John. Another audience member wonders if applicants might have safety on their mind. I know you mentioned this earlier, and be unwilling to apply for some types of work. Any additional thoughts you would offer on that kind of safety conversation, from what's been said already?
Mm-hmm. I think it's goes without saying that we're in an unprecedented period right now, one that I don't think we really have a good historical model for. We have hundreds of thousands of positions going unfilled across the US in many sectors. And I think some workers absolutely have chosen to leave their current career in a customer or guest facing environment for one in other industries. And I think a good example was highlighted in a recent Seattle Times article where a former restaurant worker who was laid off during the pandemic went and received a certification to become a solar system installer. And part of what drove that was a sense of safety, but then also a sense of ongoing job security in an in-demand industry, especially in the Pacific Northwest. And then I think we are seeing people moving to remote-based work where they can work from home. And some of that is being driven based on safety concerns.
Yeah, makes sense. I know.
And
we're all paying-
we moved 80% of our workforce to remote work over this past year. We are, I think, doing a very thoughtful and intentional strategy of what our workforce will look like going forward. I think we will have a much larger contingent of our workforce be remote. I think there will be some folks that will be hybrid, and there will be many fewer people that will return to a back office location on site 5 days a week.
Mhm. Yep. I know at Western Washington University, we're having this conversation about who's going to be continuing to be remote, hybrid, on-site. What are the demands for student success versus preferences for people's sense of safety? And we're always weighing safety. It's a hard formula, and the world's changing.
Yeah, and it's not something again, this being a recession driven by a global pandemic, it is introducing factors into job seekers' decision process that in many cases would not have existed previously. One of those being, do I feel safe returning to an industry that for my past year potentially put me and others in my family or friends at risk if I go into work every day? And never in my tenure in talent acquisition or working on workforce management have I ever experienced that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, John. I appreciate it. Looping back around a little bit, another audience question we have here comes back to Hart again. And just maybe a little bit more, if we think about the unemployment benefits and, luring people back to making a decision to go ahead and take a position. One audience member asked, have you noticed some employers have bumped up their wages and some are offering cash bonuses to new employees? Is the solution to simply pay higher wages in order to get people back into these positions?
Oh, I get to answer that question like the economist. On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. Yes, in that higher wages will help an employer attract workers. The bonuses you're seeing are not really that surprising, but a one-time bonus is different than a higher wage. That's important to remember. No, in that higher wages won't help make an unqualified worker suddenly qualified. We also have to ask who is able to pay more. Businesses that can raise the price of the products that they're selling may be able to absorb higher labor costs, but some businesses don't have the pricing power they need to really increase the wages they pay, at least in the very short run. John can probably speak to this better than I can, but if he said, let's all of a sudden pay everybody at VCU 25% more, what happens to the firm? Not as big of a factor, but we also need to recognize that wages are only a part of an overall compensation package. It's not the only piece. Some workers are going to want good health benefits as much as they want 50 cents more an hour. Other workers might want flexibility. I think I'm wondering how many companies we see get creative with childcare or other things, not just higher wages, and especially if they can't pay higher wages. Now, if I come at this question from another angle really quickly, I would love to see some wage growth, especially at the lower end And Jonathan can probably go on and on and on about some of the BLS and BEA data on wages, but the lower end of the pay scale, that world has been stagnant for far too long. Easy for me to sit here and say, gosh, I want everybody to pay their workers more. It's a complicated topic. So I'll see if anybody else wants to jump in on that.
I think, if you don't mind, one other thing, just adding on to a point that you made, you're absolutely right that I think some organizations can absorb wage increases, and they have publicly announced that. So just a couple of examples. Bank of America has announced that they are moving their baseline entry-level wage from $20 an hour to $25 an hour by 2025. And Chipotle recently announced that, I just actually did a deck for some folks internally around some reasons why we're seeing increases in attrition. Chipotle is increasing their average minimum wage to $15 an hour across the country. They're seeking to hire an additional 20,000 new workers. So that's obviously, restaurant industry role. And employees that move into a management track potentially can earn over $100,000 a year within 3 years of entry. And you think about what that could mean for someone who is accustomed to working in a restaurant industry role and making $8 to $11 an hour. If they really can deliver on that, that is a huge driver, I think. The other thing, to Hart's point, is when you start thinking about smaller businesses, especially retail businesses, another big factor for them right now is supply chain driven price increases. I was reading something yesterday about there's apparently, I'm not somebody who drinks this, so I didn't know, but apparently there's a national boba tea shortage, like the little tapioca pearls. There's a national shortage of those. And so boba tea shops across the US are having to put out on all their social media that they're having to increase prices because their price of the raw material has gone up substantially, and they can't absorb that cost entirely. They have to pass some of it along to the customers because it's mostly all produced in Taiwan, and there's a huge pinch point at our ports of entry right now. Right. So when you combine that with then having to pay more for that front of house staff in a restaurant like that, that's very difficult for somebody who owns one or two shops rather than a Chipotle.
Well, they see sales go down a little bit with those higher prices. So it's not just pass it on to the customer and nothing else changes. There is a feedback there.
Well, thanks for that. And again, the complexity and understanding the ecosystem is really important. I do want to note one thing. James is in the background paying attention to data points and questions that are coming in. And he did note that Amazon has announced today that they're going to allow 2 days a week remote work for their employees continuing. So there's one big organization in our area and others that's making a decision in that regard. So, and
that's actually a modification of an earlier decision where they were asking all of their workers to return on site. And it's also been interesting on that same point, if you don't mind. Apple has been in the news recently because Tim Cook said, we want everybody to come back into our corporate locations. And a big contingent, a big contingent of employees signed a letter saying, hey, we don't think that's necessary and we don't think that's the right way forward. And Apple has traditionally been intensely secretive, where you don't hear these kind of things being brought out in public. So for this to actually make the news cycle is really profound, I think.
Thank you for that.
Sorry.
Please.
Sort of to speak to that, and sort of I agree with John Hart's analysis here in terms of what we've seen in the job posting data. We have, and I believe this is addresses, I think, one of the questions I saw in the chat as well. We have seen an increase in the number of job postings that are offering remote working options and capabilities. And so in sort of a variety of different occupations as well. And that's been an increase from, just looking at the 2019 data versus present day, which, sort of makes sense because of everything was going on with the pandemic. But even if you look at from January to March of this year, compared to March till now, till June, there's been an increase in the volume of job postings that mentioned being able to work remotely. So it's definitely a trend that we're seeing in the job posting data as well, which is confirmed by those sort of press reports and articles, like the Amazon mentioned, or I believe I read an article saying Twitter's allowing employees to work remotely after the pandemic. So it's definitely something that we're seeing in the job posting data as well.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Jonathan. That's exactly where we need to go. It reminds me of another one of our audience questions that's right here that I think comes to you, just asking if, do you have any statistics specifically related to new college graduates, by the way, and new college graduate employment? And especially right now, here we are at commencements coming up here at Western right now. So what do you know about that? Is there any data?
Yeah, so it's a little bit difficult in that, as sort of John mentioned, everything's sort of changed. Everything's changing sort of rapidly, and data collection process tends to be a little bit slow. But in terms of the environment for sort of new graduates, it's a much better employment environment than it was for those 2020 graduates, because everybody's sort of staffing back up to their pre-employment levels. In terms of within our economic development software, JobsEQ, we do have information around sort of new graduates and sort of what programs they got their degrees conferred in, and sort of what types of degrees they had, whether it be community college associate's degrees, undergraduate bachelor's degrees, or graduate degrees. But unfortunately, like I said, that sort of data collection process is a little bit slow. So we just about to get the data for that 2019 to 2020 academic year. So it's going to be a whole another year before we see that sort of 2020 2020 to 2021 academic year, which I'm actually really excited to see, just because we were talking about earlier how maybe the additional or supplemental unemployment benefits gave people a chance, or a little more of a security blanket, to go back and the school and improve their sort of skill set. I have some personal anecdotes in my life where I know somebody who's in the service sector, sort of working at a sort of a barista, got laid off, went to one of those coding boot camps, and is now working as sort of like a fellowship, a fellow programming fellowship for Google. So, from barista to coder for Google is a pretty large change. Long story short, the data doesn't necessarily speak to it, but general economic conditions are better for new graduates than they were for 2020.
Yay, new graduates. That's good news. Yeah. Hey, a couple of audience questions that relate to some of our earlier conversations too. One person saying that they're an instructor at Western, and they've seen an increase in demand for graduating students looking for meaningful work. These are students who are also concerned about climate change. How will employers authentically respond to demand for meaningful work? And I also want to connect that to some pre-webinar conversation we had as a group, talking about the young generation that's able to make some real choices right now, and some of the factors that are allowing them to make some very different choices about how they are engaging the workforce and how they're finding meaningful work for themselves. Really, any of the three of you that might want to speak to this issue of meaningful work and what younger generation is doing right
now. I'll jump in while the others collect their thoughts, and I hope I don't make a fool of myself just babbling. I think the meaningful work conversation, at least in my head, I keep it separate from what's happening in terms of the sudden mismatch in the labor market. But I think it's going to be a powerful driver going forward, rewarding employers who can be creative and do want to accommodate and listen to employees, uh, a business still has to be viable. It still has to work, but letting employees find new ways to do things that might be lower impact on the waste stream, lower impact on in terms of carbon equivalent emissions, et cetera. How, but meaningful doesn't have to just mean environment, right? There's lots of dimensions. And I think understanding what employees need to feel good about going to work is definitely an emerging area in the labor market. And I know we've actually talked with some folks at Chmura about that, but it's how businesses function. It's harder to measure in terms of labor and so on, but it is definitely powerful and emerging.
Yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate it. Jonathan, anything to add in this issue of meaningful work and how people are choosing their pathways right now? Okay.
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, John.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, we haven't conducted a specific search. I mean, around sort of looking at the job posting data and sort of seeing if employers are mentioning things like corporate social responsibility terms or something like that. But that's definitely something we can look at potentially in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I'm aware of and that I've not only seen transpire in my own household, as we were talking about earlier, but I think we are seeing as a trend is people who have been in career track roles with corporate organizations, late Gen Z, millennial in particular, over this past year, it has been such a profound year for so many people and so impacting that you're seeing people who are saying, I now have enough of a nest egg, driven by the fact that they were able to potentially move out of a very high cost of living urban area and move somewhere much more affordable in the past year, who have in many cases retained their jobs, but may have really hit burnout due to both the layering of sort of an always on environment at work, coupled with everything that may be happening in their personal lives outside of work, that they've said, you know what, I'm ready to jump out of a career path role and pursue something that is important to me. Mm-hmm. Whether that be a side hustle that they've been doing already, whether it be something that they've long told themselves that they were going to do and just haven't, because the only option has been, I've got to stay on the career track in order to afford the lifestyle that living in this high cost urban area so I can be proximal to my employer requires. Mm-hmm. And I was saying to the other panelists earlier that this has happened in my own household. My spouse, who's a millennial, left his last job as a software developer in mid-late December to pursue building his own project, which is something he had told himself for 15, 20 years, I'm going to do this at some point. And this was the driving factor that, you know what, that life is now. Like, this is the time for me to do this. And I think that is still yet to be quantified about what the impact will be in terms of talent availability going forward. How many people stay on that route or continue choosing that alternate path?
Yep, I appreciate that, John. I think it's a big shift. People have had this opportunity during the pandemic to just step back.
Dennis, I'll add that the meaningful work as a big heading, it doesn't have to just be, I'm going to start a job where I can save the planet, or I'm going to just save the world. Mm-hmm. We need to think about some of the smaller steps. Ethical work, just wanting to work with an employer who treats not just everyone, right? I mean, you know, we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, we don't. We're getting there.
There's a lot to be said just about how are we behaving in the workplace. And I think a lot of millennials are saying, I'll go to the job, but I want to treat other people. I want a degree of ethics, and I want a degree of respect, and I want a quality of work in that regard that feels good.
Yeah.
I think that's important, and we've strayed from that.
If I can add
Yeah.
one last thing there, I think this is potentially going to be a real period of reckoning for employers in how they led their organization and led their employees through the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I'll add to that too. Just in terms of from a data standpoint, sort of like the quit rate was lower than sort of what we saw in the JOLTS job opening and labor turnover data set. The quit rate was lower than sort of its 2019 levels during the pandemic. So, sort of the uncertainty of that, sometimes people felt sort of tied to certain jobs. So especially some of the white collar positions. So we're expecting to probably see that increase sort of the coming year as we come out of the pandemic, as people have more options to look for things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I know we're getting closer to the end of our time together, and I think that we're on an important theme here in terms of, people have stepped back. Some people have already made their moves. And even though we're looking at the current difficulties in hiring, we might be also looking at some additional difficulties with retention coming forward for employers. Because I think there are folks out there that have explored other options, have maybe moved to different parts of the country and might be asked to come back physically and are really just waiting for that trigger to say, no, I'm going to quit. So there are some big shifts that have happened. And I think a lot of people have stepped back and maybe they said, I'm paying for childcare and it's not getting me ahead to go to work all that much. I've enjoyed being home, or turns out I don't have to have a car, or I don't have to live in an expensive neighborhood. And maybe this is a quality of life decision. So I think there are, and I do want to add what I hear the panel talking about is something else I've heard iterated, is that a lot of younger people in particular are saying, I want to work for an organization that cares about me. And that's an interesting big picture. And that's been something they've received some experience on this year. This organization behave in a way that felt ethical and felt like it cared about me. And I think going forward, that's going to be important as a part of our recruiting as well. So we have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to just give you each an opportunity to say, are there things you've thought about that are important, that our audience will want to hear about, things that are important if they're trying to hire, things that are important to this conversation that we just haven't found a good segue to. So if we can just take 2 minutes for each of our panelists to kind of say some last parts, I'd love to allow you to get there. And by the way, we've had many great questions come in that we haven't had a chance to get to. My apologies to those of you whose questions we have missed. But please go ahead. Jonathan, you want to get us out of the gate?
Yeah, sure. And just a couple of points that I forgot to mention earlier. In terms of some of the stuff in terms of sort of job posting data, and I know there was discussion about whether we're seeing trends in higher wages and offered by employers. It's like it's sort of been still too short of a period to see that sort of increased wage levels overall in job postings across occupations. We see some slight increases. And this maybe comes to one of the questions in the chat section, but like in the healthcare sector, we saw some large increases, like for registered nurses, the median hourly wage we saw in job postings was $28.53 and jumped up to $32.37 in 2021. So you're seeing that sort of being offered by employers, sort of sometimes occasionally offering higher wages. But the thing that we're mostly seeing is sort of additional perks. So the number of job posts that we've seen that have mentioned the phrase sort of signing bonuses or tuition and reimbursement, those things have increased dramatically, especially when you look at service sector occupations like fast food workers, waitresses, all sort of that stuff. So that number's increased. So that's something to sort of keep monitoring going forward. But in terms of advice for employers looking for job seekers or for applicants, I would say probably listing the wage in a job posting is sort of a helpful thing to. That way the applicant knows whether it's a job that sort of meets their salary requirements, So you're not wasting time sort of sifting through applicants and not coming to an applicant or that doesn't, the job doesn't fit their salary requirements. So that's sort of my
Nice.
wrap up.
That's a nice closing specific piece of advice. I appreciate that. Hey, Hart, do you want to take us next with any closing thoughts?
I was hoping we'd run out of time. I think my closing comment would be to ask people to be careful when you're bantering out ideas about what's going on in the labor market. Make a clear distinction between short run and long run. There are a variety of things that are happening that I think are quite short run in nature, tied to just the disruptions on the supply side and on the chip shortage, because I can't get chips to build the cars, so I can't hire people to work on. That's going to sort itself out in relatively short order. And then on the longer term, cost of housing, cost of healthcare, those aren't going to sort themselves out very easily, and certainly not by fall. We need to return to those conversations. So I think getting a feel for what is sort of normal churning disruption in the labor market that feels more dramatic right now just because of the scale and the pace, but it's okay. Employers and employees are going to figure things out. Let's get back to our conversations that are harder about healthcare, taxes, housing, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that, Hart. And John.
I think the thing that comes to mind most, sort of echoing what Jonathan and Hart both said, is stay tuned. I think there are some factors of what is happening right now that, as Hart mentioned, are more common when we emerge from a recession. So what we call cocooning, which we've talked about here, I think, where people really embed themselves in a role that, hey, I'm not being laid off. Maybe my partner, or spouse, family member has been laid off, so I've got to hold on to my job even though I was ready to move. I think LinkedIn did a survey last month where they said 54% of workers indicate that they are going to look for a new role in 2021 versus 35% in 2020. So it's a huge jump. I think there are enough factors that are currently still in play. One of those being organizations' decisions around remote versus hybrid versus on-site work. There is no consistency right now about that across in one industry, much less across many industries. I think it is going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 18 to 24 months, to see if we return more to a fully on-site or hybrid work model, or if employees really do end up with the upper hand and they say, I've had the ability to do this, I am not willing to give that up. So, traditionally employers have had the upper hand in that. They have been able to determine where somebody is going to work and how they are going to work. Are we seeing a shift now? The data suggests that we are, but we are also still not in a period of normalcy. So those are some of the things that I think about every day as a talent acquisition leader, as it's impacting our organization, and as our organization is making decisions about that I know are likely to evolve. So if I were a student right now, and I'm trying to determine, gosh, what is the market going to look like? What are the opportunities going to look like for me come next June 2022, as an example? I think the answer is there are trends. We're not sure if those trends are going to continue. I'm going to be very curious to see if they do, because if they do, they have the potential to profoundly change the way that we have worked, and also the balance of power in that process of where somebody works, when they work, and how they work.
Yeah. Thank you for that, John.
I'll add really quickly that I think watching those trends qualitatively is going to be really important. The data is a disaster right now. I mean, if you look at percentage change from 2020 to 2021, well, you're starting from such a bizarre denominator. I mean, so don't get hung up on the numbers. What John was just describing qualitatively, I think, is really important to watch.
Yeah, and some of that were themes in terms of generations wanting to work for an organization that cares about them, wanting to work for an organization that's ethical. And of course, with the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the conversations that we've had about diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, these are all themes that were pre-existing and are now potentially echoing forward. It will be interesting to see how the levers weigh going forward. Thank you, panel. This has just been a great conversation. There's so many good points that people said that we didn't get a chance to get to. So sorry we missed some things. If you look at the chat, there have been some good links and some good resource pieces that have been offered there. I need to toss it back to James for some closing remarks. Thanks again, everybody. This is great.
This has been really fun. So I want to thank all the panelists for participating today, and Dennis for agreeing to lead the discussion here. This has been great. Really appreciate all this. And John, I'll call you out again for your help here at Western with our Career Center and our career program. So thank you so much for that. I want to thank you all in the audience for joining us today for Western Insights from all of us at Western Washington University, the College of Business Economics, and the College of Business and Economics. We want to thank you for joining us today. We also want to thank the Western Alumni Association and the Western Foundation for their support of this series. And we know that they would like us to thank those of you who chose to financially support the university as part of this effort. This and previous Western Insight sessions are all available online. We've got you covered. If you have a hard time falling asleep at night, you just go to our website. You can watch all the back issues of Western Insights. We'll be sending you an email shortly with a link to those sessions. And our speakers have also assembled some resources for you to take a look at. So I'll be watching in your inbox for that later today. And of course, we'll ask for a short survey there to get some feedback on what you thought of our session today. Given your overall interest in this topic, we also invite you to take a look at Western's forecast publication, the Puget Sound Economic Forecaster. You can learn more, and you can also follow us on social media at www.economicforecaster.com. With that, have a great day. Stay safe, mask up appropriately, get vaccinated if you haven't already, and remember, you and your actions are a key part of our long-term recovery effort.
Tumble out of bed and I stumble to the kitchen, pour myself a cup of ambition and yawn and stretch and try to come to life.